Okay, so if everybody could now mute your own microphone, please.
Oh, they just undid us.
All right, thank you. And I did hit record. I appreciate the reminder. I will. Do you want to share yours or would you like me to share, Shannon?
Julia, I don't have sharing capabilities right now because I'm not the host, so that will be you.
Okay, here we go.
Okay, I think we did the housekeeping, so we're moving forward from that.
Wait.
And then really quickly, Katie, I know you were going to do purpose, but I do just want to kind of give a background and just a shout out to Melissa and Lauren. I don't know, I can't see if they're in attendance right now. I think that they are, but just to let the group know that we do really appreciate their input and collaboration as we kind of went through and started preparing for this. And then also, just to let the group know, Melissa and Lauren are the ESOL chairs for secondary and elementary. And so they were excited to, of course, collaborate with us through gaining some of this information and research as we go along. And we hope to continue that collaboration throughout the school year. So thank you again, and we're excited about that.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so like Shannon mentioned, we did this in collaboration. It's also been just an increasing area of questions and need and changes. And we just felt like this was something that we really wanted to dig into because there was that need and for our own learning, but to make sure that we're really doing what's in the best interest of students. So first, we need to balance that over-identification and under-identification of students in that EL population who might have disabilities. So making sure that we're not being overly sensitive to it or underly sensitive to it.
Process my order due to a mismatched and.
Okay, if you are not muted, if you could go ahead and mute yourself, please.
Okay, great.
Okay. I think I might actually, let me.
Oh, there you go.
Shannon, do you want to go ahead and talk purpose? And I think I can view attendees and see who's not muted and just make sure that that's all.
They're going to be more tricky about it too.
Sure, absolutely. So of course our purpose in going through all of this is that overall balance, just as we talked about earlier, the over identification and under identification, understanding the resources that we do have available in Fort Zumwalt for our EL students. And then like we talked about earlier, just improving that collaboration with the ESOL or ESOL department. I think that is really important and key because just in the, in the few times that we did meet with them, we found out that we had a lot of resources, a lot of similarities, and a lot to bring to the table between our two departments. So that collaboration piece is key, and we're excited to continue that. And then, of course, understanding the change in the language impairment criteria of that removal of the professional judgment was the big change and the big key.
Right, and even just to expand on that a little bit further, it goes in on that language impairment criteria to state that it's kind of whatever the district decides, whatever policies are put into place. And so I asked this past year, I'm like, so what policies have we put in place? What policies have surrounding districts put into place? And everybody's response is pretty much, yeah, we were starting to work on that, and then COVID happened and kind of took all our attention. So just trying to bring that to the forefront again, that we do need to have some comprehensive plan for how we are going to consider it, because it is something that happens. ESOL or EL students do have language impairments at times, just as any student would. So need to make sure that we're not misidentifying. So learning targets from today. Hopefully at the end of today, participants will gain a foundational knowledge of the ESOL regulations. So really looking at that background part that Shannon was talking about, what we've learned about just the legal mandates and what the requirements are, how our district approaches that, and what steps we take, even what supports and interventions are currently in place within Fort Zumwalt. And then learning when to make a referral for a special education evaluation. As it says in our title, this is going to be part one. We are planning part two to be more that comprehensive eval special education piece. But before we can even get to that, it's really important for us to really go in depth into what is currently in place and why is it in place. So topics that we'll cover today, in addition to those other aspects that I mentioned, will also be typical second language acquisition. It's important for us to understand what it looks like if everything is going well, to be able to differentiate what is that is just a language difference, what is actually a language disability, or even just a learning disability. We'll talk about pre-referral interventions that are in place, and also sources for referral data. Okay, so who are English learners? When we talk about English learners, these are students who are unable to communicate fluently. They're struggling with learning effectively in English. They often come from non-English speaking homes and backgrounds, and they typically require specialized or modified instruction in both the English language and in their academic courses. And we will be talking more about really how do we tease out what is that social language and what is the academic language and how that impacts the students' learning as a whole. Our EL students have a variety of experiences that also plays into just who they are as a learner. So, you know, lots of factors to consider that we'll be talking about throughout, but it's a difference if they're a first generation English learner or if they're a second or third generation English learner. Considering their ages, at what age did they start to learn English? That's going to impact them. If they're coming from, you know, kind of a traumatic background, if they're a refugee status, that also is something that just builds that profile for that child and what type of learner they are, as well as international adoptions. And again, considering the age, considering the background, considering any trauma that may have been there, just all of those aspects that need to be considered. These are current acronyms that are being used. I think it's important for us to stay up to date on these because things change as they do in the special ed world as well. So you'll hear us referencing ESOL a lot. That is English for Speakers of Other Languages, and that is used to describe the program. The teacher you'll see there is the TESOL. ELD is English Language Development. EL, we've often referred to students who are English learners as ESL, ELL, but currently the current term is EL, English Learner. Limited English Proficiency is LEP. The district uses a language use survey that is mandated, and so that is the LUS. And then for just convenience, as we all have our acronyms that we use in conversation and in reports, L1 will refer to the first or native language of the student, and L2 will be the second or non-primary language.
Okay, so then we're going to get into just some of the myths from within those ESOL programs or of our English language learners. So we're gonna just kind of go over briefly the 5 here and then go a little bit more in depth in the next slides. But one of the myths is that they must be in the US for 3 to 5 years, have a strong first language model at home, should stop speaking L1 or that primary language at home, should be beyond silent period before referring, and will get the kinds of support they need in a special education classes or classroom. So when we look at that must be in the US for 3 to 5 years, you know, I know that a lot of times that is what we have heard, you know, through special education, through, you know, just Fort Zumwalt in general. I think a lot has changed, just like in special education within, you know, ESOL as well in the last couple of years, but that definitely is a myth. Of course, a referral should be made to special education at any time that a disability is suspected. And that is for, of course, our EL students as well. So I know that with that fact, a question comes, okay, so when do we suspect a disability then? So we will get a little bit further into that within the presentation when we get to that pre-referral component, because that is one of the things that we will be talking about, because that is a little bit more difficult to kind of gather all of that information and really tease out, like Katie talked about, some of the things that we are looking at in order to say, yes, we definitely suspect a disability at this time. Okay, that myth number 2 is to have a strong first language model at home. So the fact to that is actually that sometimes EL students speak a hybrid of languages as they adapt to a new culture. And that's just like we all might. It's not necessarily a good foundation for second language acquisition. And Katie, if you want to speak a little bit more to that. Nope. Okay. I didn't know if you had anything.
I think we'll get into that in the next section. So
okay.
About the typical second. Mm-hmm.
Perfect. Okay, myth number 3, should stop speaking that primary or L1 language at home. And the fact is that having a strong foundation in the primary or L1 improves attainment of that secondary language. Of course, that helps build connections between the oral and written language in the primary, which leads to the stronger in the secondary. And that's, and if we just think about that as us, of, you know, learning language growing up, you know, labeling, all of those things that you learned, you know, when you were little, or if you have children, you know, when you're first helping them with language, a lot of that is going to help build their vocabulary, build those things in that primary language. So of course that would need to be continued with our English learners as well, which leads to the, you know, the fact that families should be encouraged to continue to speak that primary language in the home. Okay, myth number 4, waiting for student to move beyond the silent period. And this is something that we really talked about again with the ESOL chairs, because I know that they said that they saw a lot of this as well, that people were very hesitant to move forward if a student is still silent. And really that can take up to 9 months. Just because they're silent does not mean necessarily that they're not taking in information and not really kind of trying to process all of it during that time. So you should also consider a lot of that data, again, that we're going to be getting into on kind of what we're looking at. And then also talking to the parent during that silent period is really important to find out, you know, the parent concerns and what the primary language at home looks like in development within that silent period. Okay, and myth number 5. So ELs would get the kind of support they need in a special education class. And so this one, the fact is actually that a special education placement in and of itself is not an appropriate strategy to help the English language learners succeed. At all times, of course, you know, we're always looking at, like we said earlier, do we suspect a disability? But, you know, sometimes the schools may provide that because it is a service to the students. You know, we are here to help children. We are here to support students. And so sometimes that is our go-to. But often, because special education services are designed to meet individual student needs and provide supports that may not be available in the general education classroom, you know, we want to help these students. We want to help students that we see struggle, but that special education placement without careful consideration may not be likely to help them. If it's something that they're not in the need of that specialized instruction, or we haven't really teased out the pieces of language and where they are in their acquisition, then it's not going to help them to be put into that specialized instruction. It's not always only a question of language, kind of like it says. Sometimes it can actually add additional challenges by limiting that access to the core curriculum or focusing on discrete skills instead of talking through and immersing them in that broad language and more of those encompassing language type that they're going to get in their core classes. So that really constricts them sometimes when we aren't teasing out, are really, really digging through some of their resources. And as you're going to hear Katie and I kind of talk through this presentation, it really does take a village and a lot of collaboration with these particular students when we're really, really looking into the data. Anything to add on that, Katie?
No, I think that's great. And so those are just some of the common myths. And I think as we were doing our research on this, it was informative for us too. And then as we met with the ESOL teachers too, coordinators, that was talking through it even further. I think it's one of those situations that the more we just discuss it and the more we think about it and question some things, it just makes more sense and becomes more clear. So just wanted to touch briefly on the legal aspect and the mandates that are behind the program and why certain things are in place and how certain things came about. So first, the law that ESOL is under is Title III of ESSA, and it requires 3 components. First, it requires identification of language minority students. So we do that through a language use survey that parents complete when they register their student for Fort Sumwalt. And then it also requires the W-APT, which is a screening tool that if it's indicated on that language use survey that there is a second language in the home that they complete. The second part that is required as part of the law is that students are assessed in their progress in English proficiency. So you may have heard teachers in your building talk about the access or the assets test. Those are the statewide assessments that students who are accessing ESOL services are required to complete as part of that Title III law. So we'll talk a little bit more about state assessments in a minute, but just so you are aware that they are required to complete those as well as a required state assessment. And then the third provision is that students who are identified as English learners and are eligible based on the screener in that language use survey, they do receive services to increase their English proficiency and their academic achievement, which is where that ESOL program comes into play. Okay, so the state assessments. So similar to the MAP test and EOCs, the students complete that access test, but they do still in most situations complete the MAP and EOCs as well. So they can have accommodations for those statewide assessments as an English learner, in addition to, or similar to what an IEP student would receive. The ELA portion of the MAP is not required for the first year that a student is in the United States. And then scores are not included in the district data if the student has been here less than 3 years as well. So just a little background information on how all of that works. So access for ELLs is a state assessment of the English proficiency, and it's something that they generally do in January, I believe, January, February, and they get the results typically before the end of the year. So it's a good way for them to measure the student's progress from year to year that they are accessing services through that ESOL program. When we are talking about the ESOL program, they really focus on those 4 language domains of speaking, listening, reading, and writing. And then they also receive an overall composite. And the scoring on that test is a 6-point scale that ranges from entering to reaching. So you can see that you would get a lot of data from that on where the student is, how much progress they're making from year to year in each of those domains, and with their language skills overall. So this testing does begin in kindergarten. So for students who have already been identified as a student with a disability who is receiving special education services, if they are in kindergarten, first or second grade, we know they do not take the MAP test as a state assessment, but they are taking the access, which is also a state assessment. So just a little sidebar there that we need to make sure that we're considering that when we're moving through that IEP process, and that we are marking, yes, they are eligible for statewide assessments on that special considerations page, and we are completing the appropriate Form D to go along with that access test and whatever accommodations they will need. So again, the access begins in kindergarten. So those K-1-2 students who are accessing both ESOL services and IEP services do take a statewide assessment. Okay, the WIDA. This is just super awesome to me. They are an organization and they have these can-do descriptors. And this is what essentially is guiding the instruction. So they have 5 standards that promote equitable educational opportunities for the English learner. They consider social and instructional purposes, language arts, math, science, and social studies. These standards are not a curriculum or a fully complete list, but I do want to show you this website because what it does have is it scaffolds and breaks down skills in such detail that it will provide a wealth of information for you as well. So, and it goes through each of the grade levels. I did that pretty quickly just because I just wanted to give you a glimpse, but if you ever want to fall down a rabbit hole, this is a pretty cool one. So again, like I mentioned, the 4 areas are listening, speaking, reading, and writing, and then moving across those 6 levels that they use to rate a child's development, from entering to emerging to developing, expanding, bridging, and reaching. So you can identify where the student is, and as far as interventions, you can see where you would like to move them forward, how to move them forward on that reading continuum if you can identify which level they're at. So again, just a little plug for the reading or for the WIDA website. It also has a lot of other great components to it, and it is the organization that really supports that ESOL program. Okay, sidebar over. Also, they have the model performance indicators. And that's what I just showed you, I think, are those points. Or there's a different one, sorry. There is another component to WIDA, which is the MPI. And it also really breaks down skills into 3 elements. So language function, content stems, and supports. And so the function describes how students use language to demonstrate their proficiency. So are they comprehending? Are they illustrating? Are they describing? So that's going to be your action word. And then it gives you a content stem or topic that specifies the context for language instruction. And those do come from state content standards. And then it describes the level of support. So what instructional strategies, tools, accommodations, etc., are being used to assist students in accessing that content that's necessary for their communication. So that's where it might say with a graphic organizer, with it read aloud, those types of supports. So again, it gives you the function. So what's the action? What's the content or the skill? And what level of support are they requiring? So just another great resource for you to investigate. If you have a student who is receiving ESOL services or you are considering or supporting an intervention team with. In the tools and resources for addressing English learners with disabilities that came out of the Department of Education in 2016, there were 5 main indicators for what LEAs, which is our local educational agency, which is in our situation Fort Zumwalt, what Fort Zumwalt is required to do in all school districts or LEAs. So we must identify, locate, and evaluate ELs with disabilities in a timely manner. And that's what we do through our processes that we have. We must consider the proficiency of ELs with disabilities in determining appropriate assessments and other evaluation materials. So this will be something that we will dig into more completely during that part 2 of this whole presentation. LEAs must provide and administer special education evaluations in the child's native language, unless we're not able to do that, to ensure that we're really teasing out, is it a language difference? Is it them learning the second language? Or is it truly related to an underlying disability? LEAs must not identify or determine that EL students have a disability just because of their limited English proficiency. LEAs must provide EL students with disabilities with both the language assistance and services that they're entitled to under federal law. So what that's saying is that students, just because they are accessing ESOL services, does not mean that they are excluded from accessing IDEA or 504 services. They can access from multiple laws. So for IDEA and 504, we know that requires an evaluation to determine if there is a disability, if we suspect one. The evaluation cannot be delayed because of their participation in the ESOL program. Or even like we were mentioning, if they're in that silent period, if there is a reason to suspect a disability, then at any point that triggers moving forward with that. English learners may participate in every program for which they are eligible. So placement in one, as I mentioned, does not preclude them from placement in a second or third program. They can also access gifted programs, migrant education, Title I programs. So whatever a student needs, we look at them individually and see what resources they need in order to access their education. When looking at IDEA, we also need to be aware of the parents' rights, and these must be provided in a language that they understand. They have a right to participate in meetings related to evaluation, identification, or placement. They have a right to participate in meetings related to FAPE, the eligibility, the placement meeting, and they have a right to consent to special education services. Okay, so we mentioned we would talk briefly about the Fort Zumwalt process as well. So as I mentioned, there are those 3 components. Parents first fill out that language usage survey upon enrollment, which is part of that Title III law. If a language other than English is spoken in the home, then they complete that WAPT or APT, which is the screener, to get additional information. And that is how they determine if a student would require ESOL services. And then they also, beyond that, develop a limited English proficiency plan. So that would list out specific accommodations for that student that they would need to access when they are with the classroom teacher. Yeah, okay. Anything else on that, Shannon, before we move into acquisition? Okay.
Nope.
Does anybody have any questions? If you do, type them in the chat. Let's see. Lauren did make a couple comments for us. Those accommodations should be discussed with the ESOL teacher to ensure that the validity, been talking a lot already today, of the test is not compromised. Yeah, so I think that was going back to the testing accommodations. Oh, on the IEP form. Yes, okay. Thanks, Lauren. Sorry, I don't like this when we can't all communicate and talk.
They can
Oh, there you are.
unmute. No, it's just me, but I mean, they don't have to put it in the chat. I know there's a lot of people on here, so people might feel uncomfortable unmuting and asking their question. but it's easier for us to see it and answer it kind of right away and in the moment. So if you do have a question, please do just let us know and just unmute, because you do have that capability now.
Lauren, was there anything else to elaborate on in that aspect as far as the procedures?
I think, hello everyone, I'm Lauren Flaher. I am the chairperson for the elementary ESOL program in our district. And in terms of the IEP meetings that you would have to select that the student would take a state assessment, that should be a discussion with the ESOL teacher at your school. If, just like the MAT test, if you are selecting different accommodations, it can change the validity of the test. So those accommodations would need to be decided upon most likely by the ESOL teacher to ensure that validity of the test. And then also the language modification form is being updated this year. So that's something that we as a department are going to decide on how to move forward with the modifications just for an English learner in the classroom.
Great, thank you. And I think another big thing that Shannon and I learned from this experience that we've had is just pulling that ESOL teacher in and that collaboration and communication with them is really going to be one of the most effective things that we can do for that student. We're learning a lot, as we've mentioned, but also just making sure that we're all communicating and trying to pinpoint, because these are not going to be, I don't know that we're ever going to find two situations that are exactly the same as we move through this process. So just making sure that we are pulling in as many experts and knowledgeable people to that team, that problem-solving team as we move through it, is really going to be pretty critical. So we wanted to go over a section of second language acquisition and what it looks like and what some flags might be, so that we know when to say, okay, maybe we do suspect something here. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. So typical acquisition can occur sequentially, can occur simultaneously. So with sequential, obviously that's more like in sequence. So first a student or a child would learn one language in the home, and then after that's mastered, then they would learn another language after they start school or later. This is more typical of students who are immigrants, that it happens first one, then the other. The other type of acquisition could be simultaneous, where children are learning or acquiring two or more languages at the same time. That's more typical of birth, early childhood students when we consider ages of language acquisition. That's also more typical of second or third generation, that they are speaking both languages in the home, or maybe just speaking the one language in the home, but they're still having exposure outside of the home to a second language. So those would be learned simultaneously. It was interesting to note just that the majority of emerging bilingual people in the United States are currently simultaneous learners rather than sequential. There's also long-term versus newcomers. So long-term English learners have attended schools in the United States for 7 or more years, but they still require that language support. And newcomers are considered in the United States schools less than 5 years. Something that I think, again, as I talk through it, as I read more, as I learn more, is just super interesting. Maybe it's because I'm a speech language pathologist by training, but the difference between the basic interpersonal communication skills and the cognitive academic language proficiency, I think that's going to be something that teams need to really look at closely and consider closely when we're discussing, do we suspect a disability or not? So it's shortened to BICS and HALP. But with that basic interpersonal communication skills, those are more the social skills, the social language learning, and those kids can pick up on pretty quickly. Within 1 to 2 years, English learners can learn those. So they might appear If they're interacting appropriately with peers and jokes and all of that, we might think, well, no, there's no concern. Or if we see a difference between that and those CALP skills, those academic skills, the academic skills typically take 5 to 7 years in an ideal condition with all of the proper supports in place. It would take 5 to 7 years for them to fully catch up to that academic component. Now, that does not mean that we need to delay an evaluation if we are suspecting a disability for 5 to 7 years. It's just another variable to really consider and see if we notice. I think sometimes we might say, well, look how great they are socially and look how poor their academics are still. But what we really need to consider is it's much more difficult to learn all of that academic language, and not just the vocabulary that's specific to it, but also just those universal terms that we use in academics all the time that they are trying to learn and process through. So there are stages of typical language acquisition. So as we mentioned, stage 1 is going to be that silent receptive stage. Students are learning 0 to 500 words. They've been in the school less than 6 months. And the best thing that a teacher can do at this point is gesture, repeat, not pressure the student at all to talk, and use more of those receptive questioning techniques that a student can just identify without having to verbalize. So that would be the silent receptive stage. Stage 2 is the early production stage. That's when students are growing more into the 500 to 1,000 word range, typically between 6 and 12 months in the school. At this point, the teacher can give them an either or option. They can model correct responses. Again, continuing to just provide that supportive environment, downplaying the grammatical errors, really helping that student feel supported and part of that environment. Questioning can move into yes, no, providing a list, maybe help the student support them into more 2-word responses. When we get into stage 3, this is speech emergence stage. Students are growing from 1,000 to 7,000 words receptively, so meaning that they can understand up to 7,000 words. They might not be expressing all 7,000 of those yet, but they're starting to comprehend more. Been in the school about 1 to 3 years. Teacher can provide key concepts. Definitely want to check in often for comprehension. Look at performance-based assessments. So really being creative in how we're assessing and making sure that we're really trying to seek out what they comprehend and understand. Help the student expand their vocabulary and start asking more open-ended questions. Questioning could be start to move into that why, how, trying to help them grow their expressive language at this point. Stage 4 is intermediate language proficiency. This is 7,000 to 12,000 words, again, receptively, so they're understanding up to 12,000 words. And this could be 3 to 7 years in school. So, really considering what we just talked about with that CALP, that academic language is going to take up to 7 years in an ideal situation for students to really get a solid foundation of that vocabulary. Teachers can start to foster that conceptual development, make lessons more comprehensible and interactive, and really teach the thinking, the study skills, some of those strategies. Teachers' questioning could start to look more like, what would you suggest? Can you describe, compare for us? And then stage 5 is advanced language proficiency, and that is 5 to 7 years to achieve, as mentioned. And that's when we start to get more solid understanding, some mastery with that content area, academic vocabulary. The student's able to participate fully in the grade level classroom with just occasional extra support, and their grammar and vocabulary use is comparable to same age native speakers. We will find a way to share this with everybody, so you can read through these. But really, these are just some common language, behavioral, emotional characteristics of students learning a second language. So, and I think we've all experienced this to some degree, or heard this or felt this, and it's just some things to consider. You know, if they appear to be the quieter kid, maybe it's not so much that that's their personality, maybe it's their level of comfort with the situation. Students, you know, could have some of that disfluent speech or choppy speech that's, you know, maybe agrammatic. Comments might appear inappropriate, and these can be for all a variety of reasons. So making sure that we're just taking into consideration some of that anxiety, some of that withdrawal that might present itself, or that shutdown behavior that might pop up, and really working with them to figure out what's the underlying reason for that. Is it, you know, more that social emotional, or is it a language difficulty, in helping support them through that? So, typical bilingual phenomenon. These are interesting too, I think, just as an SLP, just some of the natural things that occur that is typical. So we've touched on the silent period that occurs when they're first exposed. You know, you think about putting yourself in a different culture with a different language. And yeah, I think that would be kind of my first reaction. Sit back, observe, listen. Code switching, I think, is so interesting. My cousin married a girl from Russia, and they have 4 kids together, and all 4 of them, it was just impressive to me whenever they would come visit, and they would speak with us in English at 3 years old, and then mom would ask them a question in Russian, and they would respond to her in Russian. So just the way that they can code switch and kind of sort that is just super interesting to me. Interference is a natural, typical phenomenon that we might think, is that starting to run into it? Do we suspect a disability? But it is a natural phenomenon where they might have the content or vocabulary in English, but their grammar and their syntactical structure is going to follow more that L1 structure. So just kind of crossing over there. They might have some language loss. And if you think about that, as far as the family and the culture and what the student's home is like, you know, how does that impact their family relationships if throughout this learning of a second language, they're starting to lose some of that first language? So that could be another source of social emotional concern that the student just might need some help and support through. Fossilization is when that error becomes firm in the second language, despite being proficient and fluent. So the student has reached that point of being proficient, but they might have one error, a grammatical error that they just continue to exhibit. And that's just fossilization. So it's just kind of embedded there and it's firm. And then interlanguage could appear like a language impairment. And it's when you're just kind of intermediate between those 2 languages. Again, I touched on this a little bit, but just making sure that we're having consideration for the family, for the culture. You know, families are going to come to us with different views. They're going to have different experiences with education, different levels of trust and expectation as far as what's the role of the teacher. What's the role of the parent involvement? I know we had a situation this past school year where there was a family and they were very hesitant when we started to discuss a special education evaluation, because where they were from, their town, it was a very negative connotation, and it was, you know, something that would change the course of the student moving forward in their life. And so we talked through, no, this is just more of a support. This is an added level of resource that we could provide if something is identified. So it takes a lot of communication and collaboration between the ESOL teacher, the family, if you have an interpreter present, making sure that we really get a full understanding of the background and where the family is coming from. Other considerations are just helping that student to maintain their cultural identity, thinking about those nonverbals, just even spacing, touching, gestures, eye contact, all of those things to be considered that to us, we might look at as, is there a social emotional concern, or is that more just a cultural difference between what we are used to and what this student and their family are used to? And then also religious beliefs. When we are starting to, discuss, is there some concern? What are some considerations for the English learner? We want to consider their age, that they came over to the United States. If they are coming over earlier, maybe, like under 4 or 5 years, then their exposure to that second language is going to be different than a student who has been here or has just come to the United States at the age of 12 or 13. Also want to consider what's their level of previous schooling in their first language. Have they had several years in school? Are they fully literate in their previous language? That is actually a strong indicator. If they have a good experience with print in their first language, then that's going to help them learn that second language. We also want to consider if they had prior instruction in English. What's the nature of the first language? What's the literacy background of the parents? This is something else that as Shannon and I were talking with the ESOL teachers, Lauren and Melissa, that it was, I hadn't really considered that, but what is the literacy like in the home for these students? Is it something that is, it's always out there, parents are reading, parents are writing with the students, or did they have a similar experience and never quite mastered it? And so then their student is coming in with less experience with just opportunities for literacy in reading and writing. Also considering the classroom environment and, as we've mentioned, some affective factors like that social emotional. Another variable and component to this is going to be students who are international adoptions. So these students are typically able to catch up to their peers in the absence of a disability within 2 to 3 years. So their experience is going to be different than if it is an immigrant family coming over. But on the flip side, we often are missing more background information on these students. Reactive attachment disorder, depending on if there was trauma previous to them coming over and being adopted. Some side effects of acculturation, which is just that process of adapting to the changes in the environment, heightened anxiety and stress, disorientation, maybe a loss of that locus of control, a sense of they don't have that control over their environment anymore. We mentioned withdrawal, response fatigue, resistance to the change, and silent or unresponsive. Okay, I have been talking for an awful long time. Before we move into pre-referral considerations, was there any other questions? Anything to elaborate on from anyone? Lauren, Melissa, Shannon? Okay, I'll turn it over to Shannon.
Thanks, Katie. Yeah, you covered a lot of information there. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to kind of get into the pre-referral. And again, when we talk about this, we are going to talk through just some of the things to consider, all of the data to be looking at, but just know that of course, this is not all income. There's so much out there, so much. So I do encourage everybody, we're going to give you a lot of resources and links today, but of course that can take you, once you click on one, it's going to spread out to a big spider web of many other things that you can get into and look at and research. So just kind of giving you, just the starting ground, but there is a lot of great information out there. So just wanted you guys to be aware of that. Okay, so there are 3 main categories when we're talking about those English learners that may experience some academic difficulties. So it's really important, again, to try to weed out or tease through kind of which one they're falling in. So of course, like Katie was talking about earlier, there's those with the deficiencies in their teaching or learning environment. So those are the ones that might have been very transient, didn't stay in a place too long, didn't get a really good, effective English language development or instruction and support, where they weren't there long enough, kind of a lack of instruction for that. Then there are those that are experiencing difficulties but may not be related to the learning experience or a learning disability. So again, that interrupted schooling, did they have a formal education, or was it, you know, did they just get something in the home? Were there just people that came in and tried to teach them some of academics or English or whatever they might have needed? Were there medical problems? Were they out a while because they had an injury or some medical needs? Low attendance, we talked about that, transient, and then any other factors that might be contributing to that piece that might not necessarily be a true disability related to learning. And then that third category are our English learners that truly do have a disability and are in need of special education. And that, I think, is the key piece of what is kind of that gray area, or really, really hard sometimes to really gather enough resources, enough data, collaborate enough, like Katie was saying, bring a lot of those stakeholders in to make sure that we are getting all the information that we need to make sure that we are making a really good decision in that area. Okay, so we're just going to go over some of the key elements when we're looking at that critical pre-referral information. You know, we always talk about pre-referral anytime we go into an evaluation as critical, of course, and comprehensive. But of course, with our EL students, it's going to just be a little bit more digging, a little bit more researching, and a lot more collaborating. So we'll have to know some of the key things are the background information. So the instructional programs, language of instructions, did they have any gaps like we talked about? Was it consistent? Did they move a lot? That background information piece is really, really key, especially like Katie talked about in the stages of how long or when they came to the US, how long have they been here? Where are they in their stages of that language? Student characteristics, the L1 and L2 proficiency, like we just talked about, Katie went over, immigration patterns, circumstances, cultural interactions, anything that they might, that might be a big factor within the family as well. And then we're getting into that classroom or educational piece. Have they had the qualified, staff? Were they able to differentiate? What does that environment look like in the classroom? Is it language enriched? Are they getting some of the things they need in relation to just accommodations, modifications, or even looking at the next one, the tier 1 and tier 2 responses to intervention? So that might not even be, only the classroom teacher. Who else was involved in that? Are they getting any type of language from, the SLP or anybody else that might be giving them an intervention? So that's why it's key to kind of find out who has enriched or who is working with and what has been done with the student before we're kind of looking at immediately moving to an evaluation. Thank you. And then that brings us to, of course, the involvement of the ESOL teacher. As Katie said earlier, that really is, and Lauren, I know you touched on that too, a key piece to bringing, everything to light as far as the needs of that particular student. They are so knowledgeable in, what can be brought to the table with what the student has already gained, some of the assessments that have been used with them, where are they in their language acquisition. So that ESOL teacher really is a great resource. And so when we were talking about this and collaborating, a lot of times I think, and not on purpose or by anybody that was, trying to leave them out, but I think sometimes we just forget you know, to invite the ESOL teacher to an IEP meeting or even a pre-referral, even that problem-solving meeting, you know, before we even get to evaluation is key and very important for them to participate in, and can give a lot of help when we're trying to weed through some of those considerations that we were talking about. So we are going to add a little blurb or a couple of questions to that ABOS, to our, you know, our survey, so that if it is an English learner, or they do speak a second language in the home, that it will flag to make sure that somebody reaches out or collaborates with the ESOL teacher. Like I said, they are a wealth of resource and knowledge and can definitely help, like Katie touched on today, but they really know the data, laws, accommodations, and process for our EL students. So great resource. These are actual links. So you guys will be getting this presentation that will have a lot of links and resources in it. But Katie, if you can just click on that first one, which is the screener that Katie already talked about. I just wanted to kind of give you guys a look at the actual website, which is amazing as far as resource. So over in the top left-hand corner, you can see resource library. So just wanted to point that out. It's great for a lot of resources. You can really scroll down and it gives you a lot of information just about the standards, and then developmental resource guide. I think it even goes into, if you scroll down a little bit more, interpretive guide, because I know sometimes, you know, that goes home to the parents, but I know we need to know sometimes, what does that look like? How are we interpreting some of those access scores and that type of thing? So great resource, you know, if you really want to dive into that and gain some more information specifically for some of those screeners and scores. And then Katie, if you go to the next one, this is just kind of a cheat sheet, kind of getting into, sorry, it's really small. I'm going to blow it up here for a minute. And this actually gives you, you know, contacts from DESE, you know, in case you did have any questions to reach out to them. So I wanted to make sure that you had access to that. But if you scroll down, it gives you, like we were talking about, the state specific guidance here in Missouri. But I wanted to go all the way down to the bottom because I know we kind of talked a little bit about this. Oh, sorry, will you stop there? Sorry, Katie. Yep, right there. So that kind of, I liked this one because it also told you the assessment. So in kindergarten, it tells you what screener assessment they're going to give, second grade, and then grades 1 through 12. So you are knowing what to ask for, or knowing kind of what to look at when we're looking at scores or trying to gather some of that data. So I thought that was key. But then the one thing I did want to note too is, even for our EL students, there is a place at the very bottom, keep going, for sorry, it's scrolling. Oh, declining services. Thank you. That's what I wanted to get to. Yes. So we were talking about this earlier. So the law requires, of course, that the states define English language proficiency, and that, you know, just like us with Child Find in special education, it's the same thing with our English learners. So the refusal of those services, of course, must be documented, but that doesn't release us, the school district, from its responsibility for providing, you know, that education to the English learner. So a parent cannot necessarily refuse the education if an English learner cannot access education without those services. So just wanted to kind of point out that too. That was kind of eye-opening when we talked through that, you know, as coordinators and met and collaborated with the ESOL teachers. So kind of put in, you know, into perspective, kind of that Child Find as well. We all have a, you know, a responsibility to really help these students, whether it's through ESOL, whether it's through special education, whether it's through response to intervention, whatever it may be, you know, we are here to kind of get them the services that they need, and it is truly our responsibility. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. Okay, just again, just that collaboration between the SLP and ESOL teacher during that time is also essential. And this is taken directly from ASHA. So there is a link there at the bottom for anybody that would like to explore that a little bit more, but these are just kind of the key pieces or summary for kind of what ASHA was saying for the collaboration between the two professionals. So of course, to share ideas and resources, evaluate the process towards speech and or language interventions goals, and of course the English learner development goals. So those are going to overlap a little bit. So it's really key the SLP and ESOL teacher are talking, taking data and tweaking those as they go along to see where they are in that acquisition of language. And then as Katie talked about earlier, just consider cultural and linguistic factors that may, affect the delivery of those interventions or accommodations. Okay, so this one, so this is kind of what we were talking about with the collection, of, of that data for the ELs. So a lot of times it's hard because we might just be looking at one student and their data or their access scores, and they're not given, many times during a year. You might only have that one piece of data that you kind of are looking at. So it really is key to kind of keep what it's kind of naming here through these bullet points on every student, so that we do have kind of a big picture, or comparing apples to apples when we're looking at students and where they are and coming in. You don't want to, like Katie talked about earlier, we're not going to look at a student that's been in the country for 2 years compared to a student that's been in the country for 7 years. You kind of want to look at where are they in their development. If this student came in at the same time and this student came in at the same time at the same language level, what progress has been made in both of those students. So this is just kind of not necessarily a checklist, but a good place to start in gaining all of this information for each student. So of course, their assessment information, academic information, where have they been? What grades do they have? What have they already attained? Their entry date into the US, their entry date into the local district where they are, years of schooling in home language. Again, has their education been interrupted? Have they been transient? Have they moved a lot? Have they been tested for vision and hearing? I know that we did have, a student actually last year that was an EL student, had significant, delays, not only in the acquisition of language, but also had some hearing concerns, as well as some other developmental concerns. So it's really, really getting down and weeding out, because we might not be only talking about one disability with some of these students. Any physical conditions, obviously those observations by the classroom teacher are going to be key. And then the enrollment history and anything else that may be used for that data when we're looking at placement into, special education services. Again, this isn't, the end all be all, but these bullet points here are a great place to start to at least have a collection of on every single EL student. Okay, and then we just want to make sure the equity for our English learners. So us as LEAs must design and implement services and programs that enable our ELs to attain both English proficiency and priority of participation in the standard instructional program within a reasonable length of time. So going back to that, it just really is meeting them where they are. What do they need, and just providing them that within that reasonable length of time. Also, equal opportunities for EL students to meaningfully participate in those curricular, co-curricular, extracurricular, whatever activities, outside of the school day as well. And then we're going to get a little bit more into this, like Katie said, in part 2, but really making sure that we are using appropriate, reliable, and valid evaluations and testing methods for our ELs. When we do move to an evaluation, or if the team does suspect a disability, we want to make sure that we are gathering as much data as possible, valid data. You know, we might not always be able to get a standardized score for some of our EL students, but as much as we can gain and as much information as we can use is what we want to do. And again, that might take a lot of different assessments, people, observations, really, really honing in on that data, but we'll get more into that particular specifics in part 2. Okay, and this is also just a little chart that talks about characteristics of those ELs that have developed typically as they move throughout the process, and those who may have a learning difficulty. So if you look at that, obviously I'm not going to go through each particular column, but if you just look at that, you know, typically developing ELs can be expected to make the steady progress. You know, those with a learning difficulty, the progress is going to be more uneven. Difficulties are persistent with those with a learning disability. Of course, typically developing might be similar to peers on a cognitive level, where we have seen sometimes those cognitive deficiencies or deficits with some of our EL students, which is going to cause us to look a little bit deeper into what's going on. So just wanted you just to have this, it's just a start for looking at where typical ELs, you know, might be developing through that process, and then where we need to weed out, okay, are we seeing some red flags here if it's in that column of what they may show if they have that learning difficulty. And that might not always be in language, like we talked about. You know, our ELs may have other eligibilities that we are looking at, like an SLD, like ID, intellectual disability, or it could be a language impairment, but that isn't always what we might be looking at or considering for an eligibility for these students. Okay, and then this just goes back to, again, just another good chart for some potential difficulties related to our EL students, language learners, and our special education needs. So again, we look at this, of course, with all of our students, not just our EL students, but it really is important to consider when we're looking at the possible explanations of some of these deficits. For instance, you know, is easily distracted. You know, well, sometimes in the special education we might automatically jump to, does that student have ADHD? But if it's a student that struggles with the English language, then it might not necessarily be that they aren't processing. It might be that they just don't understand the words. They're taking in so much information at one time that they just can't keep up. And it's going to require a lot more visual support for them, you know, to understand. Same thing with has trouble following directions. You know, might have memory difficulties, that's true, but maybe he just doesn't understand the vocabulary or the instructions because of that weak language piece in the English language. So again, just another good chart to kind of give you guys some background or a starting off point when we're really trying to weed out some of those things or consider when we're looking at moving into an evaluation for those EL students. Okay, and Katie, you are going to have to plug this in because again, I'm not the host. So bear with us. This should work. I think it's going to start. If you can't hear it, we'll try it in the media player, but it's just a 2-minute clip of just, again, yep, I'll keep talking. It's just a 2-minute clip of just the importance of kind of collaboration and the collaboration, especially with the ESOL teacher, And kind of, again, she's just going to be speaking about how it really does kind of take a village and really, really digging into a lot of resources that we have. And this is actually from, it'll be in the resource list at the end of this particular presentation, but this is from Colorado, and they have a ton of information and have done a lot with ELL students and just information throughout their entire state. But also this particular district that I pulled the video from has just done so much research in this area. So definitely a good place to start. Okay, Katie, you ready? Perfect. It's not playing for us.
Okay, sorry guys. We are,
Can you play it through the media piece?
yeah, I was gonna try and just play it straight, but apparently that didn't
There's
work.
Yeah, I think there's too many. It's lagging.
Okay, gotcha.
Grammarly is your personal writing assistant
Better.
for clear emails,
Okay.
confident messages, stronger essays, and more. Because sometimes the kitchen table is the office and the classroom. Grammarly offers suggestions to help you get work done from anywhere. It covers everything from correcting grammatical errors
Sorry.
to rewording a
There we go.
I wanted to change gears a little bit, talking about advocacy and the roles of teachers are playing in their school community, really around questions and special education, identifying children's needs for services, and how you see the role, particularly of ELL, ESOL, environment.
I think that primarily the teacher of the child needs to be at the table, because there are often, we have to look much deeper in the whole process of language learning and understanding what their process was for learning their first language, really welcoming the parents in and understanding what the process was for that child.
Okay, sorry. I just got word that they cannot see the video. So super bummed about this. Other thoughts, Shannon?
They would
I
have
was
to
able to see the
continue.
video. I was able to see the video, but I could also hear something coming through yours as well as them trying to watch the video.
Okay.
Is it a video with two women talking to each other?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, there's something popped up on my side panel that I had to like agree to let YouTube open.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah,
So-
you would
And I was
have to click
hearing it still come
continue.
through yours. Yeah. And I did that and I was playing, but then I couldn't listen because your
Okay.
video was playing too.
So sorry.
That's okay. I just don't know like what you want us to do. You want us to just watch the video on our own?
That would be fine at this point.
Okay.
Just make sure to watch it when we send the slide, because it'll be a link in there that'll take you straight to it.
Okay. Yep. I can't figure it out. Sorry about that, guys. But it's a very good link. So, and it's only 2 minutes long. So when you get it, please do go to it and click on it. Coming back to you, Shannon.
Sure. Okay, two different links here. I cannot say enough about the RTI Action Network. That is a great place to go anyway for interventions and everything, but they did have an RTI-based SLD identification toolkit, especially for the considerations for English language learners. So this is a great website to go to when you are looking at any type of intervention, or where to start, what to consider. It actually breaks it down into different criterions, references, anything you might need to know. Can you scroll down a little bit, Katie? Thank you. Yeah, so it even gives you kind of effectiveness, of assessments and interpretation, comparisons to populations, normative when we get into the evaluation piece, parent participation, what do parents need to know? What do teams need to know? So it really is just a great resource. Like I said, in general, just a great website, but really this particular one focuses especially on English learners and some interventions, or just a place to start. So I highly recommend kind of clicking on that and playing around and looking at the different things in that particular website. And then the next one is the DESI flowchart.
And this is probably going to be very small, but, oh, there we go.
Yes, and this one in particular is for the academic success for ELLs is what it says. Of course, we know the new acronym is ELs. And so I won't go in this. There's a lot of information on this flowchart. So again, part of what came out of that as well, though, is just making sure that we do have something in place for flagging, flagging the students, especially when we're starting to talk about that problem solving, when we're filling out the ABAS, making sure that we have, something to catch getting the ESOL teacher involved and so forth. And so this is just another good resource just for you guys to have. Again, we'll go through it a little bit more in depth when we get into part 2, which is that evaluation piece of it. But wanted you guys just to have access to it now in case you did want to explore that a little bit more. Okay. So we talked a little bit about this. These are just some of the resources. They're all links except for that book there. That book isn't a link, but that is a really, really great book. That is a resource for special education considerations for English language learners. Gives a lot of information. Like I said, Katie and I could have probably made a PowerPoint today of, 85 slides that we would have never gotten through, but there's just so much information out there. We're just hitting, the tip of the iceberg, which is some of the things that we talked about and are kind of listing here today. So we'll make sure to give the main ones, like I said, that will probably take you, into a little bit of a broader general area. Each website's going to lead you down a different path kind of on your own time of whatever is interesting or what pinpoint you want. But we'll continue to add to that resources page 2 before we send it out. And then we did, of course, want to leave some time for any questions, comments, or anything else that we can clarify or answer for you guys today. So you do have the ability to unmute if you do have any questions. Please do so. Or comments.
And we are also monitoring the chat and the Q&A. So if you'd rather type it rather than ask it, we can read that for the group and ask that as well.
Okay. Don't see any coming into the chat. And I don't hear anybody from the cloud speaking to us, just a voice. So, okay. Well, we really appreciate your participation with us today. Hopefully everyone will be joining us for part 2, which is that evaluation piece of it, really diving deep into assessments, tools, data collection, and the other different resources that we will be using in collaboration with, of course, all of the other resources and people that we talked about today when we move into looking at that special education and do they qualify for a disability. So hope to see everybody then. Glad that we were able to get you out a little bit early, and I hope everybody enjoys the rest of their afternoon. Thank you guys so much for joining.
Yep. Thank you. Have a good day.